So, good morning everybody, and welcome to another episode of Topical Talkology. And today's a rather special occasion because we're actually celebrating our first anniversary of having started these podcasts, which originally started off as original chat, and then we decided to turn it into a podcast because the content that we were coming up with sometimes was actually quite deep for just a normal coffee conversation. So we had to justify it somehow by actually recording it and actually make it sound more just as clever as we are when we're actually having a conversation.
For posterity. For posterity. Good morning and happy anniversary.
Good morning. Happy anniversary on that one. So that's really good. So anyway, so today's topical talkology, and it's something that has been creeping up in the news because we are in May, people are taking their exams soon, and some people are going to go to university and some people are going to decide that they're going to go to work after their A levels. And here's the thing, is the further education or higher education actually worth the investment these days?
Well, that's the problem, isn't it? We're talking about private, are we?
Well, any public university is a minimum charge of $9,000 a year. So by the time a student has gone to university and they've then have to live within the campus or outside the campus, by the time they're coming out of university, they're already coming out with about a £50,000 debt at least.
Gosh, I mean, where's the equality in that?
Well, and here's the thing, I don't think if you actually become bankrupt, that debt goes away. So it's almost one way in where let's call it the establishment, is looking to control you by keeping you in debt. Do you think that's probably one of the reasons why?
It's definitely not a good vote winner, is it? And again, where is the equality? Because of course, when you and I were at university, we got grants and we didn't pay for the education.
Well, maybe you did. I didn't. I had to do it the hard way. I went to evening classes to get my postgraduate, and I had to pay for that. But that was my choice. The opportunity was available to me. But circumstances have changed. I mean, universities can't rely now on. They can't rely now on free education because this is what was happening. It was particularly in the baby boomer generation, that would then be passed on to. So you've gone to university, it's free, and ultimately it's the workers later on down the line who actually pick up the tab for that. In some ways, now what you're actually saying is, well, we're not really asking you to pick up the tab. We're asking you to pay up front for your education rather than pay for it later on in life.
The difficulty is, of course, that that removes equality of opportunity, doesn't it? Because those who can afford it will pay for it directly, and those who can't will be saddled with a huge debt for the rest of their working life.
That's right, but it's interesting how you're focusing on the equality, and I'm focusing on, is it a worth return on investment? Because is it a return on investment? Because let's face it, 2/3 of students that are actually coming out of university who are going into jobs, they're actually going into jobs they're overqualified for. So, because it's not just about one thing, it's not just about your ability, it's about how marketable you are, it's about, do you fit into the company brand, do you actually have the right connections, and it could very well be your parents. I mean, there's a few people who've probably gone to the PricewaterhouseCoopers of this world whose parents are probably partners in another well-established accountancy firm, and that's how they bounce it around. So there's a number of variables that actually make up as to when someone comes out of university. In some ways it could actually be academic. I mean, look at Stephen Hawking. I mean, let's face it, they in some ways they almost like had to. They looked after him for so many years, even though he was in a wheelchair and he couldn't speak because of his motor neurons disease, because his brain was so valuable to contribute to society.
Well, I mean, the simple fact is it used to be worth going to university because university guaranteed you a job. And therefore you immediately got onto the career ladder, and as long as you put in the work and you were diligent, you were going to go ahead in life. Whereas nowadays, of course, university, what's happened is because people are having to pay for it, then universities have done everything they can to expand their places. Dropped their entry requirements, and suddenly you have a complete deluge of people going to university, with the universities scooping up all the tuition fees. And now, of course, there's this issue of of educational inflation, In other words, a university degree really counts for nothing anymore, really, unless you're doing a vocation such as law, such as medicine, maybe even accountancy. Apart from that, it means nothing. And then you have to start going to do masters and PhDs and MBAs, and then MBAs have lost their true value anyway.
It's a good one, because there's a guy in an American he's an American TV presenter, and he actually drew up this question. I think his name's Tucker Carlson or something like this. Mm-hmm. And he's on Fox News, and one of the things he actually did say, particularly about the American educational system, although I suspect that it's also quite synchronatic with what's actually happening over here as well, is that people are having to pay more to go to university each time. But what happens is the degree passes are actually getting easier. In other words, people are actually coming out with higher, more qualifications, yet it's only in effect is actually just get more money into the system. So they're making compromises on the standard of the education to do that, which is why companies are having to take a lot of things into account and and all the variables. And here's another thing. I've always said this, and I've omitted it from my upcoming book actually, but particularly that university should be an apprenticeship for what you're going to do in life. If you're going to do a history degree, for example, unless you are going to become a historian and become a history professor or history teacher or something like this, it absolutely has no value in the corporate marketplace if you're not going to utilize it, which means I believe you've wasted 2 years of your life getting a degree just to have a piece of paper where you're not going to actually use it. So it is 2 years of knowledge that you've wasted on a subject matter that you're not going to utilize.
Well, not necessarily, because some firms will give you on-the-job training, but they want evidence of someone who shows an ability to have discipline and stick to things and achieve.
But a lot of companies now are actually not even looking to recruit people from university, because if they're going to have to train them up themselves, why not train them up at 18? Why train them up at 23 or 21 or something, or 22?
Correct, and those are the more forward-thinking companies. And the same goes, and there's of course a ripple effect back to school, because nowadays, of course, everyone, you and I were taking our A-levels. 3 C's was considered pretty good. Now 3 A stars is considered the minimum. So
if you want to get into a good level university, and here's another thing about the equality thing that you were talking about. It also depends what university you actually go to, because as you know, I talk a lot about status and hierarchy and things like this in my subject matter, and what university does give you, if you want to go into a professional environment, it does give you status. It does give you evidence of your capabilities and abilities, and I've said that. But
it needs to be the right university.
But it's got to be the right university. So if you go to Oxford and Cambridge, yeah, you're probably almost assured of a job, because such a big brand name behind you on your CV, that's always going to get you through the door. Then if you went to some small universities no one ever heard of. So Russell Group universities do actually attract more, or people who've gone to Russell Group or Ivy League, if you're listening from the States, universities do attract more people from the workplace, because they see you as having that extra ability, because you've actually had to get there in the first place. But saying that, and I've totally lost my thread on where I was going to say here, so maybe you can jump
in.
There
is a status issue, of course, because one of the most important things in life is to have an innate positive thinking instilled into you. And if you do go to some of the upper private schools, St Paul's, Harrow, Eton, Rugby, and then you go on to one of the top universities, Oxford, Cambridge, Imperial, you get imbued with an expectation that you will do well in life, and that has been shown to help you get through life. In other words, if bad things happen to you, you will expect yourself to get through them, whereas if that hasn't been instilled in you, if bad things happen to you, you don't expect to get through them, and so you don't do as well. So it's not just the physical education that you get, and it's the sense of grooming for success in your life.
Well, we've always talked about
plus the contact. Plus the contact. If you go to these places,
and absolutely. And as I said before, there's a lot of variables. So if you go to a strong university with a good reputation that you've actually heard, that you've got that's got a brand name, for example. You are going to develop connections, which are highly important if you actually want to move forward. So you're expanding your network. You are recognized. Your status has improved because of where you've actually been to, and you've actually gone through that. You will, and let's face it, you will have to gone through some sort of strenuous type of selection process to get there. And as I said, unless your father was a professor at Cambridge or Oxford or whatever, or some places like that, who can probably get you in through the back door. But you know what? While we may say it's unequal, that's the world, and that's the game, we play. I mean, nepotism is part of life, and we can get pissed off with it, or we can just sort of accept it and actually learn to play by our own rules in some ways, or start changing the rules if you actually want to do that. But one of the things that I wanted to talk about in terms of the content that you actually learn, look, I think your universities are very outdated with what they're teaching you. And this is why it's not a good return on investment. As I said, I see it as an apprenticeship. And what you're learning is very much sitting there amassing theory, amassing knowledge. Now, in this day and age, you can go onto Google and probably pick up several bits of information on a subject matter, which can be fairly accurate. Some of it's not, but some of it's fairly accurate. So you don't really need to actually have all that information. And universities probably also almost need to be going down an experiential route where actually they're practically applying it, because I know that there's training companies in Australia which are following like a 70-30-10 rule, where they're only giving you 10% of content. 70% is actually doing it in terms of experientially, and the other 20% is actually based on coaching and feedback, which is ultimately which is probably the biggest chunk of where you're actually getting your expertise or you're developing your subject matter in. What do you think?
Again, that sounds very sensible.
You're a doctor.
We haven't talked about the fact that there's the mix of students, have we? We haven't talked about the fact that more and more ladies are going to university, and right now, for instance, there are more female medical students than there are male. We also haven't talked about the fact that universities are hotbeds for neo-Marxist and the identity police either.
Actually, it's a very good question. I don't think is it as prevalent here as it is in the States. I know Berkeley, but I think Berkeley University in California has always been very much a very left-wing establishment, and even when they get right-wing speakers in there, they will genuinely protest so they don't have them. So they're not really actually quite open-minded to actually having a long-term point of view. So I'm in two minds here, because students between the age of like about 14 and 21 are looking to find their identity. They're looking to where they fit in. So I can't remember what book I read it in, I'm afraid, but they were talking about between the years of 0 and 7 is the imprinting stage of your life. And the Jesuits priests even said, give me a child until the age of 7 and I'll give you the man. And then between 7 and 14 is the conditioning stage, which is, guess what, when we go through the school system. So in some ways you could actually argue are schools there developing us into leaders, or are they just developing us into conformists to be workers? And I suppose that's a whole another subject matter altogether. And I suppose it depends on where you go to school, because some schools actually are grooming you for leadership. So the more elite schools will groom you for leadership, whereas some of the more state schools, because they're having to deal with larger numbers, they're expecting you to conform to the system, conform to becoming a taxpayer, conform to going through that process, because they want their They can't have too many chiefs. They just want a lot of Indians.
And that's something that isn't in the statistics, because the current statistics are it doesn't matter what type of school you go to, whether it's state or private. What matters is the individual's dedication to study in terms of getting into university.
Look, there's a lot of things. As I said, we talk about variables, but there's a lot to look into here. Everybody's got a different learning style. I mean, the thing is, if you're an auditory